3 o'clock in the morning, September 3rd, 1786, in the spa town of Carlsbad, one of the most celebrated writers in Europe slips out of his lodgings alone. He has told no one. He carries almost nothing. In his pocket is a passport bearing a false name, and by sunrise he is simply gone, a minister of state, a famous poet, vanishing from his own life like a debtor fleeing in the night. How does the author of one of the most beloved books of his century come to feel imprisoned by his own success? Why would a man the world envied risk everything to become nobody in a foreign country? And what happens when he returns? Because he does return, carrying something no one in his old life is prepared to understand. Tonight we follow the complete life of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, from a merchant house in Frankfurt to the court of Weimar, to the ruins of Rome, to a sealed manuscript waiting beside a deathbed. So settle in, and let the day loosen its grip. We are going back to Germany, to the year 1749. Frankfurt, at the middle of the 18th century, was a city that took itself seriously. It was a free imperial city, answering to no local prince, only to the distant Holy Roman Emperor himself. Its merchants were wealthy. Its churches were old. Its houses leaned over narrow streets that had been carrying traffic since the Middle Ages. Emperors were crowned there. Fortunes were made there. And on the 28th of August, 1749, at the stroke of noon, a child was born there whom admirers would one day call the last man to know everything. The birth was difficult. In his memoir, Goethe recorded the family story that he came into the world nearly lifeless, and that the household despaired of him before he drew breath. He also noted, with that smile that runs underneath his prose, that the stars that day were said to be exceptionally favourable. We should pause on that memoir for a moment, because it will follow us through this whole first chapter. Goethe called it Poetry and Truth, and the title is A Confession. He wrote it as an old man, looking back across 60 years, and he openly admitted that memory and imagination had long since grown into each other. So when we tell the stories of his childhood tonight, we are often telling them the way he chose to remember them. That does not make them worthless. It makes them evidence of something else. They show us how a great mind wanted its own beginning to look. The house on the Hirschgraben, Vastal, dark and full of order. His father, Johann Caspar Goethe, was a man of means who held the title of Imperial Councillor, a title he had purchased, and who held no actual office to go with it. Picture that for a moment, because it explains so much of what follows. Apprécié, educated, disappointed man, wealthy enough to need no work, and proud enough to be wounded by his own idleness, living in a city that had politely declined to employ him. Johann Caspar turned all of that blocked ambition inward, onto his house, which he rebuilt, onto his collections, which he catalogued, and onto his children, whom he undertook to educate personally, with the thoroughness of a man building the careers he himself had been denied. There were 2 children who lived. Wolfgang was the eldest. 1 year behind him came his sister Cornelia. And if you remember only a few names from this whole night, let hers be one of them. Brother and sister grew up as a closed alliance of 2, drilled through the same lessons, hiding from the same paternal inspections, reading the same forbidden novels She was sharp, serious, and by the account her brother gives, the first audience he ever wrote for, and the first critic he ever feared. Other children were born into that house and died young. 4 of them. A grief the memoir touches only briefly and then steps back from, the way one steps back from a cold doorway. The boy learned Latin and Greek, French and Italian, drawing, music, riding, and law. Lessons filled the days the way furniture filled the rooms, completely, and by design, and yet the house had a second climate, a warmer one. His mother, Katharina Elizabeth, was barely 18 years older than her son. She was quick, funny, and a natural storyteller. She would spin tales for the children at night and stop at the most unbearable moment, promising the rest tomorrow. Wolfgang would lie awake inventing endings. Sometimes, she recalled in her old age, he would confide his own version to his grandmother in secret. Then, when the story resumed the next evening, the boy waited to see whether fate agreed with him. Storytelling in that house was not entertainment. It was a game of prediction, played for the highest stakes a child knows. The stakes of being right about how a story ends. One Christmas, his grandmother gave the children a puppet theatre. In the memoir, Goethe treats this small wooden box almost as a holy object, and biographers have generally followed him, because whether or not every detail is polished, the pattern is unmistakable. The boy did not simply watch plays in that theatre. He took it over. He wrote for it, staged for it, directed Cornelia and the neighbourhood children, and discovered the particular pleasure of a world small enough to control completely. Keep that image beside the image of his father, cataloguing his collections in the rooms below. 2 floors of the same house. On each of them, a person arranging a miniature world exactly to his liking, because the real one would not cooperate. Then, when the boy was 6 years old, the real world announced itself. On the 1st of November, 1755, an earthquake struck the city of Lisbon. Far away on the coast of Portugal, it was All Saints' Day, and the churches were full when they fell. Fires followed the tremors, and the sea itself rose and came in over the harbour. Tens of thousands of people died, though the exact number was uncertain then and remains debated now. The news travelled across Europe for weeks. It arrived in pamphlets, newspaper reports, and sermons, growing more terrible with each retelling. And it arrived, in time, in the nursery on the Hirschgraben. For us, it is hard to feel the size of this event. So let me put it this way. Lisbon was one of the richest and most devout cities in Christendom, and it was destroyed on a church holiday, at the hour of morning mass, while the faithful knelt inside. All over Europe, people asked the same question at the same time. How could a good God permit this? Philosophers argued about it in print. Voltaire wrote about it. Preachers strained to explain it. And in Frankfurt, according to the memoir, a 6-year-old boy listened to the adults repeating the sermons and the explanations, and found that none of the explanations worked. The Creator he had been taught to think of as wise and merciful had shown himself, at the very least, difficult to understand. The first crack had appeared, not in his faith exactly, but in his willingness to accept an answer just because a grown-up gave it. Here is the editorial point I want to leave with you. The thing this chapter is really about. We like to imagine that genius begins with an ability, a gift for words, a gift for numbers. With Goethe, the record suggests it began with a refusal. The refusal to let a story end wrong in his mother's nightly game. The refusal to accept the official explanation after Lisbon. The refusal, even in that little puppet theatre, to remain in the audience. Everything he would become is already visible here. The Poet, the scientist who trusted his own eyes over the textbooks, the minister who reorganized whatever he touched, all of it begins with a child who kept quietly insisting on checking the world for himself. The world gave him more chances to practice. In 1759, when he was 10, French troops occupied Frankfurt during the 7 Years' War, and a French officer, Count Thoranc, was quartered in the Goethe house itself. His father seethed at the intrusion and, by the family's telling, barely contained his fury for the years it lasted. The boy did something more interesting. He watched. The Count brought painters into the house and commissioned works from local artists. And Wolfgang drifted among the easels, listening, absorbing the French theatre that the occupation brought to town. His father saw an invasion. The son saw a window. It is one of the earliest recorded instances of a talent Goethe would keep all his life, and one his critics never forgave him for. The talent for finding nourishment in circumstances he was supposed to merely endure, and through all of it, the lessons continued, because Johann Caspar had a plan, law at Leipzig, then a legal practice, then marriage into a good family, then, at last, the civic honours that had eluded the father would be gathered by the son. It was a complete design for a life, drawn up by a man who specialized in complete designs. There was only one difficulty. The subject of the design had, by his mid-teens, begun writing poetry in secret, falling in and out of love with alarming ease, and privately concluding that the study of law was among the least interesting activities available to a human being. In the autumn of 1765, at 16 years old, Wolfgang boarded a coach for Leipzig. He carried his father's instructions, his mother's stories, a trunk of respectable clothes, and no intention whatsoever of becoming the man the plan described. Behind him, at a window of the house, on the Hirschgraben, stood the sister, who now faced the lessons and the inspections alone. He would write to her constantly. He would return to the house, in time, but never as a boy again. And once, years later, he would return as a patient, carried home to be saved. The coach rolled north. Let it roll for a moment, through the flat autumn fields, while we go ahead of it to Leipzig and to the first great collapse of his life. Leipzig called itself Little Paris, and it half believed it. The city was smaller than Frankfurt, but newer in spirit, full of fashion, theatre, publishing, houses, and students with allowances. Into this world, in October of 1765, came a 16-year-old from Frankfurt with good Latin, provincial clothes, and an accent the locals found amusing. They let him know it. Within weeks he had ordered a new wardrobe and begun scrubbing the Frankfurt out of his speech. If you have ever arrived somewhere young, and felt the doors of a room close politely against you, You know what those first months tasted like? We can watch these years from an unusual angle, because the long letters he sent home to Cornelia survive. They are a strange and touching mixture. Half of each letter is the older brother performing his new sophistication for the girl still trapped in the schoolroom. The other half is homesickness, imperfectly disguised as advice. He lectured her on reading, on style, on how to think. And underneath the lecturing, you can hear a boy talking to the one person with whom he did not have to pretend. Hold on to that channel between them. It carried his first drafts, his first confessions, and it will carry worse news before long. He was enrolled to study law. He attended the lectures, found them to be exactly the inventory of dust he had feared, and quietly moved his real attention elsewhere, to poetry lessons disguised as literature courses, to drawing classes with the painter Adam Friedrich Ozer, to the theatre, and to the daughter of the innkeeper at whose tavern he took his meals. Her name was Anna Katharina Schönkopf, called Käthchen, and she was his first real love affair rather than a boyhood crush. It followed a pattern worth noticing, because it will return. He won her, grew sure of her, then grew jealous without cause. He tested her patience with scenes and accusations until the thing broke, and then mourned what he himself had wrecked. He was 17, then 18. The poems he wrote about it still read like a young man performing sadness in a mirror. He knew that too. He said so later. What happened next was not performance. In the summer of 1768, a few weeks before his 19th birthday, he suffered a violent hemorrhage in the night, blood from the lungs by most accounts, and came very near the edge. The precise diagnosis is beyond recovery at this distance, and biographers have offered several candidates. The effect, though, is documented. The brilliant boy who had gone to Leipzig to conquer it came home to Frankfurt in a coach, thin, grey, and defeated. A failed student with no degree returned to the house of a father whose entire architecture of expectation now had a crack running through it. Johann Caspar did not take it gracefully. The son later recorded the chill in the house with some care, and Cornelia, caught between the invalid upstairs and the disappointment downstairs, nursed her brother through the worst of it. The convalescence lasted the better part of 2 years, and it changed him in a direction nobody had planned. Confined to his room, he fell under the gentle influence of a friend of his mother, Susanne von Klettenberg, a pious, intelligent woman devoted to a quiet, mystical Christianity. With her encouragement, he read religious writers. Then, because he was Goethe, he kept reading past the approved shelf, into alchemy, into hermetic philosophy, into strange old books that treated nature as a single living secret waiting to be read. Here is my editorial claim for this part of his life. Those sick-room years look like a detour, and they were actually a foundation. The conviction that nature is one connected whole, that the same forces work in a leaf and a storm and a human heart, never left him. It would surface decades later in his botany, in his theory of colours, in Faust. The law student died in that sick room, quietly. Something more unusual got up from the bed. His father, who measured recovery in credentials, sent him to Strasbourg in the spring of 1770 to finish the law degree. Strasbourg is where the world finally caught fire. It began, fittingly, with a building, the cathedral there, a single tower of red sandstone lace, was officially considered barbaric in that era, because it was Gothic, and Gothic was out of fashion. Goethe stood in front of it and decided the official opinion was simply wrong. He climbed it, repeatedly, partly to cure himself of dizziness by force of will, which tells you something about the man. Then he wrote a rapturous essay declaring this despised style to be true German art. A small thing, an essay about architecture, but watch the shape of it. Everyone says this is ugly. I have looked at it myself, and it is magnificent. That sentence, in one form or another, is the engine of his entire life. And then came the meeting. Johann Gottfried Herder, 5 years older, and ferociously learned, was in Strasbourg that winter for a painful eye operation. Goethe attached himself to the older man's sick room like an apprentice to a forge. Herder mocked him, corrected him, dismantled his Leipzig elegance, and handed him a new set of convictions. Real poetry is not polished in salons. It grows wild, out of a people, out of folk songs, out of Homer, out of Shakespeare. Goethe absorbed it all with the completeness he brought to everything. He would say afterward that the encounter was among the most significant of his life, and modern scholarship agrees. If you want a single point where German literature turns and becomes something the whole world will have to deal with, that sick room in Strasbourg is a defensible choice. But Strasbourg holds one more story, and it is the one that costs the most to tell. In the countryside nearby lay the village of Sesenheim, where a pastor named Brion kept a household that seemed, to a visiting student, like something out of an idyll. The pastor had a daughter, Friederike, about 18, and the young man from Frankfurt fell for her in the direct, uncomplicated way of that whole spring. Through the autumn and winter he rode out to the village again and again. There were poems, real ones this time. Some of them are counted, by common critical judgment, among the first great lyric poems in the German language, poems with wind and hoofbeats and heartbeats in them. On her side, and on her family's side, matters looked serious, and there is little doubt they had reason to think so. In August of 1771, degree in hand, he called at Sesenheim one last time. He said goodbye without saying what the goodbye meant, and rode away to Frankfurt. Shortly afterward he ended the relationship by letter. In the memoir, he confessed that he handled it badly, and the guilt stayed with him. Friederike never married. He, meanwhile, would spend years writing versions of the same scene. A gifted man wins a trusting girl and abandons her. Readers have long noticed that the abandoned women in his work, including one in Faust, whom the world would come to know very well, carry something of Sesenheim in them. He said the wound worked on him for years. His art keeps the receipts. I promised you honest editorial judgment. So, here it is. You can read this episode charitably. A very young man refusing a life he was not ready for. Or you can read it plainly. A talented person discovering that he could take what he needed from someone and leave, and that the world would let him. Both readings are supported. What is certain is the pattern it set. From now on, whenever life closed around Goethe, he would do what he did at Sesenheim, and what he would one day do at Carlsbad in the dark. He would go. The gift and the guilt of the man are the same trait, seen at different hours of the day. for the moment, though he is 22, licensed at last to practice law, and back in his father's house, with a drawer already filling with pages. Among them are the beginnings of a play about a rebel knight, and somewhere just ahead of him, waiting in an ordinary little town called Wetzlar, is a summer that will break his heart on schedule, and a book that will set the whole continent talking. Wetzlar, in 1772, was a small town with an oversized courthouse. The Supreme Court of the Holy Roman Empire sat there, buried under a backlog of cases that had been pending, in some instances, for over 100 years. Young lawyers were sent there the way young officers are sent to quiet garrisons, to season slowly. Goethe arrived in May, at his father's insistence, registered at the court, and then attended it, by the general agreement of witnesses, almost never. He walked, he read Homer under the trees, and in June, at a country ball, he met Charlotte Buff. Lotte, as everyone called her, was 19, capable and warm, the second oldest of a large family whose mother had died. That loss had left her half-sister and half-mother to a crowd of younger children. There is a scene every Goethe biographer repeats, because he made it immortal. Lotte, in a plain white dress, cutting bread for her brothers and sisters in the evening light. He saw it, or something like it, and went under completely. There was one complication, and he knew it from the first evening. She was engaged to a decent, steady, hard-working man named Johann Christian Kessner, and she never seriously wavered. What followed instead was a long, strange summer of threes. Goethe and Lotte and Kessner walking, talking, reading together, the two men genuinely fond of each other, the situation genuinely impossible. Kessner's own letters, which survive, describe his rival with a patience bordering on the saintly. By September, Goethe did the Sesenheim thing. He left abruptly, a note behind him, no goodbye in person. That might have healed like the others. But in the autumn of that year, news reached him that a young man he had known slightly in Wetzlar, a legation secretary named Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem, had shot himself, reportedly over his hopeless love for a married woman. He had done it with pistols borrowed, through an innocent intermediary, from Kessner himself. Goethe was shaken in a way that went beyond grief. He gathered every detail of the case he could, and the details sat inside him for more than a year, combining slowly with his own summer, the way two chemicals sit in a sealed jar. Then, in the early weeks of 1774, the jar broke, in roughly 4 weeks, according to his own later telling, a telling written with suspicious neatness, but broadly accepted in outline. He wrote a short novel in letters called The Sorrows of Young Werther. A gifted, oversensitive young man loves a woman named Lotte, who is promised to a good man named Albert. The love is impossible. The young man spirals downward through the second half of the book, and at the end he borrows Albert's pistols and takes his own life. Goethe had welded his own summer to Jerusalem's death, changed just enough, and kept just enough that everyone in Wetzlar recognized everyone. Kestner, understandably, was furious. The real Lotte was mortified. The author apologized in letters and did not withdraw a page. What happened when the book appeared? In the autumn of 1774, had few precedents in the history of publishing. The novel did not merely sell, it detonated. Editions and pirate editions multiplied across the German lands. Translations followed into French, English, Italian, and beyond. Readers responded not as if they had found a book, but as if the book had found them. Young men in several countries began dressing in Werther's costume from the novel. The blue coat and yellow waistcoat. There were engravings, imitations, parodies, even Werther-themed merchandise, down to painted porcelain. Decades later, Napoleon Bonaparte would tell Goethe to his face that he had read the novel 7 times and had carried it on campaign in Egypt. Hold on to that detail. Those two men will meet in this story, and we will be in the room. And then there is the darker legend, and here I owe you precision. It was said, almost from the beginning, that the novel set off a wave of copycat suicides. Young readers found dead with the book beside them. That claim became so famous that in modern psychology, the documented phenomenon of imitative suicide after publicized cases is actually called the Werther effect. But when historians have gone looking for the original wave itself, the evidence turns out to be thin. A handful of reported cases, some poorly attested, amplified by moral panic. Several cities and authorities did ban or restrict the book. That much is documented, Leipzig among them. So the honest summary is this. The panic was real. The bans were real. The actual body count behind the legend is unproven, and was probably small. The story of Werther killing readers is, in large part, a story Europe told itself about the frightening new power of fiction. The book's power over its author is easier to document, because he complained about it for the rest of his life. At 24, Goethe was suddenly one of the most famous young writers in Europe, and famous specifically as Werther, the weeping, doomed, sensitive. Strangers arrived expecting a man permanently on the verge of tears. They found instead a robust, ambitious, frequently cheerful person who liked wine, skating, and being right. He suggested afterward that he had written the book to get the crisis out of himself, a confession that saved him. The public read it as a costume he was refusing to take off. For half a century, wherever he went, whatever he built, someone would step forward, eyes shining, to ask about Werther, and the great man would grow visibly cold. He had built the trap with his own hands, and it was sprung on him for 50 years. If you have ever been introduced at a party by the one story about yourself you most want retired, you have stood for 1 second where he stood for a lifetime. Here is what I find most revealing. Though, look at what he did next, because it is not what anyone would predict. A celebrated young author, with publishers begging and every salon open, chose none of it. In 1775, his engagement to a Frankfurt banker's daughter, Lili Schönemann, collapsed under family friction and his own cold feet. One more door he backed away from, and that same autumn an invitation arrived that his father considered an insult and a dead end. An invitation to visit a court so small that respectable maps could be forgiven for missing it. Ruled by a duke who had just turned 18, Frankfurt said no. emphatically, in his father's voice. The young man packed. Why does one of the most famous writers in Europe abandon literature at the peak of its heat, to review road repairs and mine shafts in a miniature duchy? The answer says everything about who Goethe actually was. Underneath the blue coat the public had nailed onto him, it waits for us in a town called Weimar, where the snow is already falling. Past midnight. In a village in Thuringia, in the winter of 1775 into 76, the houses are dark. The street is frozen mud, and the only sound is dogs. Then hoofbeats. 2 riders come through at full gallop, cloaks flying, laughing like schoolboys escaped over a wall. Lamps flare in a few windows. By the time the shutters open, the riders are gone into the dark toward the next village. One of them is the reigning duke of this country. The other, the villagers will learn in time, is the author of the most talked about novel in Europe. The respectable classes of the duchy are asking each other, in letters that survive, the same question the villagers are asking through their shutters. What, in heaven's name, is going on at Weimar? Here is what was going on. Weimar, when Goethe's coach had rolled into it in the first week of November 1775, had about 6,000 inhabitants. Frankfurt had 5 times that many. There was no real industry and no great river trade. By several contemporary accounts, livestock still crossed the streets on the way to pasture. The palace had burned down the year before, so the court operated out of borrowed quarters. This was the destination for which a famous young writer had turned down everything, and if his father had called the journey a mistake, the first look out, the coach window, offered little rebuttal. But Weimar had one asset no map could show: its rouler. Duke Karl August was 18 years old, newly installed, newly married, restless, physically fearless, and hungry for a companion more interesting than his court. He had met Goethe on the road the year before and had decided, with the total certainty of a teenager, that this was the man. What followed the arrival was, by the standard of small German courts, a scandal. The Duke and the poet rode wild across the countryside, hunted, swam in icy rivers, and generally behaved like 2 young men who had each found the brother he wanted. The old guard at court was appalled. A commoner, a scribbler, whispering daily into the ear of the sovereign. The complaints in the surviving letters are not gentle. Then, in June of 1776, the Duke did something far more radical than midnight riding. He appointed Goethe to the Privy Council, the small circle that actually governed the duchy. A seat, a salary, real files on a real desk. His chief minister threatened to resign over it. The Duke's written reply deserves to be heard across 2.5 centuries. Other courts, he argued, would judge him not for employing an extraordinary man, but for failing to use him. The minister stayed. Goethe stayed. And here the story most people know about Goethe simply stops matching the facts. Because the poet did not dabble in government, he disappeared into it. Count the portfolios he accumulated over the following years, because the list is almost comic. The War Commission, responsible for the duchy's tiny army and its recruitment. The Roads Commission, responsible for highways and bridges. The Mines Commission, created to reopen the old silver and copper mines at Ilmenau. Into that project he poured years of effort, and we should say plainly that it ultimately failed, drowned in water and debt, and it haunted him. Add the court theatre, the parks, fire response, and eventually, in 1782, effective oversight of the duchy's finances. That same year the emperor granted him a patent of nobility, and the merchant's son from Frankfurt became von Goethe. His father, who had spent a lifetime wanting exactly such honours and never getting them, lived just long enough to see it. The record of what Johann Caspar said about it is thin. Perhaps that silence is its own answer. In the middle of these climbing years, the worst letter of his life arrived. In June of 1777, word came from the south that Cornelia was dead. She had married a friend of his, Johann Georg Schlosser, and gone to live in a small town in Baden. And the surviving letters suggest the marriage had made her quietly miserable. She died at 26. In the weeks after bearing her second child, Goethe's diary entry for the day the news came is a single dark line, and those around him recorded that he shut himself away. The first audience he ever wrote for was gone. He rarely spoke of her afterward, and when he finally did, near the end of his life, dictating his memories to his secretary, the grief in the old man's account still reads fresh. I will add one editorial sentence, and mark it as mine. Of all the debts this story will count, the one to Cornelia is the quietest. A brilliant, trapped woman who got the same education and none of the doors, and whose brother walked through every one of them carrying her half of the inheritance. He answered the loss the way he would answer every loss. More work. And now, the question I promised you, why? Why does the author of Werther spend his late 20s inspecting road gravel and auditing regimental budgets? His letters from the period give pieces of an answer, and his later reflections give more. Put together, they suggest something like this. Fame had made him famous for a self he considered finished. The weeping boy in the blue coat. Literature, as a career, meant performing that self forever. Weimar offered the one thing the applause could not. Resistance. Real material. Real consequences. Budgets that would not balance because you wished them to. Miners who needed wages. Roads that flooded regardless of your genius. He believed, and said in several forms across his life, that mastery shows itself in limitation. The decade in the files was Goethe limiting himself. On purpose. The way an athlete limits himself with weights. That is the noble reading, and I believe it is largely true. But you deserve the cost accounting too, because it is also documented. The writing nearly stopped. The great projects of his 20s, Faust among them, sat in drawers as fragments, and stayed there. Visitors from the literary world came away puzzled or disappointed. Some of his old friends concluded, in print and in letters, that Goethe, the poet, had been swallowed by a minor court. 10 years is a long time, from 26 to 36. The years in which most poets build their cathedral. One of the greatest poets alive was, to outward appearances, a conscientious bureaucrat in a town of 6,000, growing more silent, more formal, and, by his own later admission, more inwardly desperate with every passing winter. Something else was holding him in Weimar through those years. Though, and it was not the mines, Within days of his arrival in 1775, he had met a woman at court, 7 years his senior. With her began the strangest, longest, most disputed relationship of his life. To understand why the escape, when it finally came, had to happen at 3 o'clock in the morning under a false name, you have to understand her first. Her name was Charlotte von Stein. She was 33 when Goethe arrived in Weimar, a lady-in-waiting to the Dowager Duchess, married since the age of 21 to the Duke's Master of Horse. A decent and largely absent man, she had borne 7 children and buried 4 of them. Let that sentence sit for a moment. It was not unusual for her century, and it explains something about the stillness people described in her. Contemporaries record a slender, dark-eyed, quietly commanding woman, not a great beauty by the fashion of the day, but possessed of something rarer, a kind of finished calm. The young genius who arrived that November, all velocity and no brakes, took one look at that calm and recognized the exact thing he did not have. What followed lasted, in its full intensity, a little over 10 years, and we can watch almost all of it, because Goethe wrote to her constantly and she kept the letters. Something over 1,700 of them survive. Notice, letters, sometimes several in a single day. They are one of the great documented obsessions of European literature. Her side of the correspondence is missing. She asked for her letters back late in life and is generally believed to have destroyed them. This is worth saying clearly. We hear this love story in one voice only, his. Every judgment anyone makes about what Charlotte von Stein felt, wanted, allowed, or withheld is reconstruction. Biographers have filled that silence for 2 centuries with theories. The silence itself is her only surviving statement, and it may be the most eloquent thing in the whole file. What the letters show, on his side, is a progression with no parallel in his life. It begins as infatuation, frank and hot, and she evidently rebuffed that, firmly, more than once. It then becomes something the 18th century had a category for, and we mostly do not. A passionate soul friendship conducted under rules. He submitted to the rules. She corrected his manners, cooled his tempers, taught the wild young man of the midnight rides how to move through a court without leaving broken furniture. He handed her, in return, everything: drafts, plans, confessions, moods, the raw daily feed of one of the most productive minds in Europe. In one much-quoted letter he told her that she was the only person to whom he could show himself whole. Scholars still argue about whether the relationship was ever physical, and the honest answer, the only answer the evidence supports, is that no one knows. What the letters document beyond argument is dependency. His, deep, daily, and increasingly anxious as the years passed. Here is my editorial reading, offered as a reading and nothing more. Charlotte von Stein was the first person who ever made Goethe work for approval on someone else's terms, and that is precisely why he could not leave. His mother had adored him automatically. Fame had adored him automatically. Cornelia had believed in him before he had earned it. Here, at last, was a person whose regard had to be earned each week, by discipline, by patience, by becoming calmer and finer than he naturally was. for a man secretly afraid that he was all fire and no form. That offer was irresistible. She civilized him. His own letters credit her with it. But a tutor's love has a built-in ceiling. The moment the pupil is finished, the arrangement has nothing left to produce. By the mid-1780s, the letters begin to show exactly that suffocation. Gratitude and resentment braided so tightly that even he could not always tell them apart. Picture him, then, in the summer of 1786. Because all the lines of our story now cross in one man, 36 years old, a minister carrying half a government, with a failing mine on his conscience, a poet whose great works lie unfinished in drawers, whose public still greets him as the author of a novel he wrote at 24, a brother who has buried his only sister, a son whose father had died in 1782, closing forever certain accounts between them, and a man bound for over a decade to a woman he could apparently neither fully have nor bring himself to lose. That July he went, as he often did, to the spa at Carlsbad, where the Weimar court took its cures. The Duke was there. Charlotte was there. On the 28th of August they celebrated his 37th birthday. Everything looked usual. He had, in fact, been preparing for months. He had quietly secured from the Duke an open-ended leave. Its true scope apparently vague even between the two of them. He had arranged his files and gathered money. He had obtained a passport in the name of Johann Philipp Moeller, merchant of Leipzig. He told no one his destination, not the Duke, in full, not Charlotte, at all. And in the small hours of the 3rd of September, 1786, the scene from the beginning of our story finally arrives in its proper place. A man slips out of a sleeping spa town alone, climbs into the mail coach, and gives the one instruction that 10 years of his life had been silently building toward: south. Charlotte von Stein learned of it the way the servants did, afterward, from letters sent back along the road. By most accounts, she never truly forgave him, and the friendship that eventually resumed years later was a pale, formal thing beside what the 1700 letters record. When people speak of the cost of Goethe's freedom, hers is the name. The bill is usually written in, but the coach is moving now, and it is moving toward the one country he had been promised since childhood. In his father's travel stories and the engravings of Rome that hung in the Frankfurt house, the man in the coach is done being famous, done being useful, done being good. For the first time since he was 16 years old, nobody in the world knows where Johann Wolfgang von Goethe is. And now we go with him, over the Alps, down into the light. The mail coach travelled fast, because the man inside paid it to. He crossed the Brenner Pass in early September, dropped down through the Alps, and began recording everything: weather, rock formations, the faces of towns, all of it in a travel diary kept for one reader only, Charlotte von Stein. That tells you something about how tangled the human heart can be. He had fled her without a word, and he narrated the flight to her, page by page, as if the leaving and the loving were two separate accounts held at the same bank. At Lake Garda he was nearly arrested. He had stopped to sketch an old castle tower, and the local authorities, in a region alert for Austrian spies, found a stranger drawing fortifications and took an interest that grew official quickly. The scene as he tells it in the Italian Journey, has the comic timing of a man who knows he is finally inside a story worth telling. He talked his way free. Partly, he claims, by having a local vouch that the drawing was harmless. Whether every beat of the anecdote happened exactly so, we cannot verify. The Italian Journey as a book was assembled and polished decades later from the diaries, so it is memory arranged by a master arranger. But the underlying record is solid. The route, the dates, the sketching habit, the hunger, above all the hunger. This was a man eating a country. Verona gave him his first Roman amphitheatre. Vicenza gave him the buildings of Palladio. An architect he came close to worshipping. Venice gave him the sea, which he was seeing for the first time in his life, at 37 years old. There is a passage where he stands on the Lido, listening to the water, and understands. He says, what half the poetry he had read all his life had actually been describing. Then the road bent south again, through Ferrara and Bologna, and he began refusing to stop properly anywhere, because one name was pulling on the whole journey like gravity. On the 1st of November, 1786, he entered Rome through the Porta del Popolo. In the journal he marks the arrival as a kind of second birthday. He would write that only in Rome had he begun to feel truly happy, and the claim, extravagant as it sounds, is backed by nearly every letter he sent that winter. Understand what Rome meant to a German of his century, because it was not tourism. Rome was the examination at the end of an education. His father had made the Italian journey as a young man, had filled the Frankfurt house with engravings of Roman views, had drilled the city into his son as both promise and reproach. Every educated northerner carried Rome in the imagination the way people now carry places they have only seen on screens. The arrival was a collision between the imagined city and the real one. Goethe managed the collision his own way. He refused the role of celebrity traveller, kept the false name at first, and folded himself into a small colony of German artists living near the Corso, sharing plain lodgings with the painter Wilhelm Tischbein. One of the most famous writers in Europe spent his Roman days as an anonymous middle-aged student, sketching ruins, studying anatomy, filling notebooks, standing in line to look at things. Tischbein, during these months, painted the portrait that has become the face of Goethe for the world, the traveller reclining in the Campagna among broken stones, in a pale coat and wide hat, gazing past us. It hangs today in Frankfurt, in the Stadel Museum, and here is a small human detail verified by generations of amused viewers. The figure's proportions are subtly wrong. Most visibly, by common observation, the left leg is too long, and the 2 feet do not quite agree with each other. The grandest portrait of the age of Goethe contains a drafting error. I find that strangely fitting, because the whole Italian journey is like that. A masterpiece with the seams showing. A man mid-repair, pretending to be at rest, because that is my reading of these 2 years, and I will mark it plainly as mine. The Italian journey is usually told as an artistic pilgrimage, and it was one. He finished plays there that had sat frozen for a decade. Iphigenia, Egmont, largely, and he worked on Tasso. But read the letters and a second journey shows underneath, closer to convalescence than to study. In Rome, nobody needed him. No files, no petitions, no mine, no court, no daily examination by a beloved judge. He rose when he liked, drew badly and happily, learned by looking, and he discovered, his letters suggest, that the person underneath the minister and the famous author was still alive and was, of all things, cheerful. He tried, seriously, to become a painter, and the verdict of that experiment mattered as much as any masterpiece. He learned, by honest daily effort among real painters, that his talent there had a ceiling. The man who could not accept an official opinion about a cathedral accepted this one completely, because he had tested it himself. He came away from Italy knowing not just what he was, but what he was not. The second knowledge is the rarer possession. In the spring of 1787 he pushed further south, to Naples, where Vesuvius was active. He climbed it repeatedly, getting close enough to the vents on one ascent that the account still quickens a reader's pulse. Cinders underfoot, sulphur in the air. A middle-aged privy councillor peering into the throat of the planet. Sicily followed, by sea. With seasickness he turned into observation like everything else, and in a public garden in Palermo. Among plants he had never seen growing wild. The old sick-room idea from his Frankfurt convalescence stirred again. The intuition that all plant forms might be variations of one underlying form, one archetypal plant, an Urpflanze, as if nature composed its endless species the way a musician composes variations on a single theme. Hold that thought gently. It sounds like a poet's daydream, and in the strict botanical sense it was superseded. But the deeper instinct inside it, that living forms are transformations of common patterns, points, in the judgment of many historians of science, toward ways of thinking that biology would later make central. We will meet it again in a Weimar garden. He stayed in Italy almost 2 years. The Duke, remarkably patient, finally needed an answer, and in the spring of 1788 the answer had to be given. What is astonishing is not that Goethe went back, it is what he negotiated. He returned to Weimar, released from nearly all his administrative burdens. He kept his seat, his salary, the theatre, and the scientific institutes, a settlement almost without precedent, a servant of the state paid to be. Essentially, himself. On the road north he wept, he admitted afterward, like a man leaving home rather than returning to it, and he was right to weep, in a way he could not yet measure, because the Weimar he was returning to had not moved, and he had, the collision between the man Rome had rebuilt and the town that remembered the old one is its own story. There is a scandal at the centre of it, and a young woman with dark curls, whose name the fine society of Weimar would spend 20 years refusing to say at dinner. He reached Weimar in June of 1788, and within weeks the whole shape of his life changed twice, once publicly, once in secret, and the secret one lasted longer. The public change was the cooling. Weimar received back a man visibly altered, browner, calmer, more formal, and by many accounts more distant. The court found him changed for the worse, less available, less theirs. Charlotte von Stein and he met again, and whatever was said, the correspondence that survives afterward has frost on every page. She had not pardoned the manner of his going, and the new man had no intention of resuming the old dependency. The breach between them became, within a year, effectively total. Weimar society, which had watched the friendship for a decade, chose its side largely against him. It chose against him with particular energy because of the secret change. In July, a few weeks after his return, a young woman approached him in the park by the river. She handed him a petition on behalf of her brother, an aspiring writer fallen on hard times. She was 23. Her name was Christiane Vulpius, and she worked in a small workshop making artificial flowers. The petition worked. Eventually, for the brother, it worked immediately, and in a different way, for everyone else involved, because Christiane did not leave Goethe's life again for 28 years, until her death. Let us be precise about what happened next, because it scandalized a duchy, and the record is clear in outline. Within a short time, she was living in his household as his companion in everything but law. At Christmas of 1789, she bore him a son, August, the only one of their 5 children who would survive infancy. The sentence I have just said, 4 children lost, should be allowed its full weight here, as it was for Charlotte von Stein, because that grief sat inside this famous house too. Goethe did not marry Christiane. He also did not hide her. Exactly. He did something Weimar found harder to digest than either sin or discretion. He simply lived with her, openly at home and invisibly at court, for 18 years, through mockery that is well documented and sometimes vicious. She was called, in one contemporary sneer that biographers still quote, his fatter half. The court ladies would not receive her. Charlotte von Stein's recorded remarks about her are cold enough to burn. And here I will give you my editorial judgment without hedging, because I think the evidence carries it. This relationship, so long treated as an embarrassment by polite biography, was one of the most honest things Goethe ever did. Christiane was cheerful, practical, unbookish, and real. She ran his house, loved dancing and the theatre, sent him letters full of daily life spelled the way she pleased. He answered in kind. Hundreds of these letters survive, and they show, under the teasing, a durable working tenderness. With Charlotte von Stein he had performed a refined self for a tribunal he could never fully satisfy. With Christiane there was no tribunal. The man who had needed a decade and an escape to Italy to stop auditioning finally lived with someone who had never asked him to audition. Weimar sneered at the mismatch of minds. The mismatch was the point, and, I would argue, the marriage that eventually came, and we will see under what dramatic circumstances it came, only certified something that had been true since 1788. Meanwhile, the released minister filled his freedom with a new obsession, and it was not poetry, it was nature. The garden intuition from Palermo now became a working program. In 1790 he published an essay attempting to show that the organs of a plant, seed leaves, foliage, petals, stamens, can be understood as transformations of one fundamental organ. The leaf, metamorphosis as the secret grammar of botany, and this new program stood on older foundations, because his most celebrated anatomical work was already behind him. Back in 1784, between the files and the mines, he had taken on a curious wall in the science of his day, received opinion held that humans lacked a certain small bone in the upper jaw that other mammals possess, the intermaxillary bone, and this absence was cited as proof of a gap between mankind and the animals. Goethe, dissecting and comparing alongside the anatomist Loder, argued the bone was present in humans, fused and disguised. He was not alone in the claim. Priority is shared by fair accounting with others. Notably, the French anatomist Vicq d'Azyr, but his demonstration was real work, and the instinct underneath it, that nature does not build walls between related forms, has worn well. The poet was reasoning like a comparative biologist a generation before the word existed. I want to pause on why this matters for our whole story. It is tempting to file these years under eccentric hobbies of a genius. The evidence reads otherwise. Goethe's science and Goethe's poetry come from a single conviction. The world is one continuously transforming whole. And patient, loving observation of particulars is how truth is reached. In a leaf or in a life, Rome had taught him to trust his eyes. The botany was Rome, continued by other means. And when, decades from now in our story, an old man defends a strange theory of colours against the entire physics profession, you will recognize this same conviction, magnificent and stubborn, arriving at its costliest hour. For now, picture the household on the Frauenplan as the 1790s open. A famous man nobody at court quite likes anymore. A young woman nobody at court will greet. A baby son. A garden full of experiments. Unfinished manuscripts stirring again in their drawers. It looks, at lust, like a settled life. It had barely a year of grace, because, to the west, in the summer of 1789, a crowd in Paris had torn open a fortress prison. The shockwave was rolling east across Europe, slowly, then quickly, until it reached even the quietest duchy in Germany, and pulled its most famous citizen, of all unlikely places, onto a battlefield in the rain. A summer evening in Weimar, July of 1789. The mail from the west is late, and when it comes in heavy. Newspapers, letters, pamphlets still smelling of ink. In the reading rooms and drawing rooms of the little capital, people pass the pages from hand to hand. A fortress prison in Paris has been stormed by a crowd. Its governor is dead. The King of France is bargaining with his own subjects. Within days, everyone in the duchy who can read has read it, and everyone who cannot has heard it. Something enormous has begun, and the young men of Germany greet it. That first summer, like a sunrise, most of literary Germany fell in love. Klopstock wrote odes to the revolution. The students who would become the Romantics never forgot the feeling of those first reports. And in Weimar, one of the most famous writers alive looked west at the sunrise, and, by every surviving account, narrowed his eyes. Goethe's coolness toward the French Revolution is one of the most documented and least flattering facts of his middle life. So let us handle it honestly instead of hiding it. He did not defend the old French court. Its rottenness he considered proven. He had followed the diamond necklace scandal of the 1780s with fascinated disgust, and he said later that it had shown him the moral decay of the French aristocracy before the Revolution said it louder. but he distrusted sudden ruptures with something close to physical aversion. His sciences had taught him, or he had chosen sciences that confirmed, a temperament that believed in metamorphosis, gradual transformation, the leaf becoming the petal by degrees. A mob, in his view, was nature operating without form, and form, for Goethe, was very nearly sacred. You do not have to share the view. Many of his best readers, then and now, have not, but it was a considered position. He paid for it socially in a generation that largely disagreed with him, and he held it in public for 40 years without apologizing. In 1792, the argument stopped being philosophical. Prussia and Austria went to war against revolutionary France, expecting a short parade to Paris. Duke Karl August held a Prussian command, and he wanted his friend along on the campaign. So it happened that in the autumn of 1792, the author of Werther rode with the invading army into Champagne. A 43-year-old civilian observer with a scientific notebook, watching one of the hinges of world history swing in the rain. The campaign was a disaster of mud and dysentery. It ended, for practical purposes, on the 20th of September at a place called Valmy. There, the ragged citizen army of France stood on a ridge by a windmill, held its ground under cannon fire, shouted Vive la Nation, and did not run. The professionals of Prussia, unnerved by a foe that refused to behave like a beaten army, halted. Soon after, the long retreat began. Militarily, it was hardly more than an artillery duel. Historically, many have argued, it was the moment the revolution proved it could survive. The French Republic was proclaimed in Paris almost immediately afterward, and here we arrive at one of the most famous sentences ever attributed to Goethe. I owe you the full, honest frame around it. In his account of the campaign, he describes the evening after the cannonade, the shaken Prussian camp, officers asking him, as the resident thinker, what he made of it all. His reply, as he records it, was that from this place and this day a new epoch of world history begins, and you can all say you were present at it. It is a magnificent sentence. It is also a sentence published in a memoir written some 3 decades after the fact, by a man in his 70s shaping his life for posterity. No independent witness from that evening confirms the words. Historians, therefore, treat them with respect and suspicion in equal measure. Perhaps he said it, perhaps he sharpened, over 30 years, something vaguer he had felt in the rain. What the sentence certainly records is his considered verdict, and on the verdict he was simply right, which is its own kind of astonishing. The man who disliked the revolution understood its scale. That evening, or at least in memory, better than the professional statesmen around him, he saw worse the following summer. In 1793 he accompanied the Duke again to the siege of Mainz, where a French garrison and German sympathizers held the city against a Prussian bombardment. He watched a German city burn under German guns. When the city fell, and crowds moved to lynch departing collaborators, there is an account, from his own telling, of Goethe stepping in personally to stop a mob from tearing a man apart. Asked why, he answered, in words that have come down to us in several versions, that he would rather commit an injustice than tolerate disorder. That sentence has been thrown at him ever since. fairly and unfairly, as the motto of his politics. I will only say this: he had now seen the thing itself, twice, at close range. The fires, the roads full of refugees, the bodies in the mud. Unlike almost every other writer of his generation, his opinions about revolution were formed downwind of one. The sunrise the poets saw from their desks. He had smelled. He came home from the wars to Christiane, to his son, to the garden, and made a decision that looks like retreat and functioned like strategy. He would answer the volcano with a hedge. While Europe burned, Weimar would build, quietly, a counter-world of art, science, and form. All he lacked was an ally of his own size. He was about to find one, in the last place he expected, in a hungry, brilliant, half-dying younger rival he had been politely avoiding for 6 years. Friedrich Schiller was 10 years younger, and everything Goethe was not. Goethe was the son of comfort, Schiller of poverty. Goethe had drifted into fame on a novel written in a few weeks. Schiller had clawed his way up from a military academy he remembered as a kind of prison, had written a rebel play, The Robbers, that made him famous at 22, and had become a fugitive shortly after, fleeing a duke who had forbidden him to write. He was tall, red-haired, perpetually broke, perpetually ill, and he burned with a speculative, philosophical intelligence that built systems the way Goethe grew plants. Through the late 1780s, the two men circled each other, in and around Weimar and Jena, with elaborate courtesy and mutual allergy. Schiller privately called the great man an egoist, and worse, in letters that survive. Goethe privately found the younger man's early plays a glorification of exactly the formless violence he despised. They were, by their own later cheerful admission, almost designed to misunderstand each other. The hinge came in July of 1794, in Jena. After a meeting of the Natural Science Society, the two men left together and fell into conversation. Goethe, warming up, explained his beloved idea of the metamorphosis of plants, sketching the archetypal plant as he spoke. Schiller listened, nodded, and replied with one sentence that should have ended the friendship before it began. "That is not an experience," he said. "That is an idea." Goethe, by his own delighted retelling years later, felt his temper rise, controlled it, and answered that in that case he had ideas he could see with his own eyes. The story comes to us shaped by both men afterward, so treat its polish accordingly. But the underlying event is solid, and what followed is one of the best documented relationships in literary history. Within weeks, Schiller wrote Goethe a long birthday letter analyzing the older man's mind with such uncanny accuracy that Goethe said no one had ever understood him so well. The correspondence that began that summer runs to roughly 1,000 letters over 11 years. By wide critical agreement, it is one of the great books of German literature that neither man knew he was writing. What did they actually do for each other? Strip away the marble. And the answer is practical, almost technical. Schiller gave Goethe pressure and belief. It was Schiller who demanded, letter after letter, that the abandoned fragments come out of the drawers. The two works we most associate with Goethe's maturity, the novel Wilhelm Meister and above all Faust, were dragged back into motion under Schiller's relentless, loving siege. Goethe said it plainly. Schiller had given him a second youth. In the other direction, Goethe gave Schiller ground. The philosopher who could vanish into abstraction for years was pulled back toward the concrete, toward the stage. The astonishing run of Schiller's late plays, Wallenstein, Mary Stuart, William Tell, was written in constant dialogue with Weimar and its theatre, which Goethe directed. They edited each other. They plotted literary journals together. In 1796 they published hundreds of anonymous satirical epigrams, the Xenien, mocking the mediocrities of the German literary scene, which responded with the fury of the accurately described. The year after, as if to show the mockery had been throat-clearing, the two staged a friendly competition writing ballads. 1797 entered German schoolbooks as the year of ballads, and generations of children would memorize the results. Here is my editorial claim about this famous alliance, and I will mark it as mine. We usually talk about friendship as comfort. This one was infrastructure. Two men consciously decided that a language scattered across hundreds of small states, with no capital and no academy that mattered, should have a classical literature. Then, in one small town and one decade, they manufactured it. The phrase historians use, Weimar classicism, sounds like a period label. Up close, it looks like a construction site with two foremen who checked each other's load, bearing calculations weekly. Neither could have built it alone. We know this with unusual confidence because we can read them saying so to each other in real time, and the whole time one of the foremen was dying. Schiller's health, ruined in his youth, collapsed repeatedly through these years. He worked through illness at a pace that reads today like slow, deliberate combustion, wrapped in blankets, writing masterpieces between attacks. In the spring of 1805, the attacks won. He died on the 9th of May, at 45, and the autopsy report on his lungs, which survives, uses language a modern reader does not forget. The household judged Goethe too fragile to be told directly. He was himself ill that spring. By the accounts of those present, he understood from the faces around him what no one would say, and finally said it himself, in the form of a question, and then went to his room. In a letter written soon after, he said that he had lost a friend, and in that friend the half of his own existence. He was 55 years old. He would live 27 more years. For the rest of his life, by many testimonies, he could hardly speak of Schiller without visible effort. The construction site fell silent, half finished. Faust was still a torso, and history, far from pausing for grief, was accelerating. 5 months after Schiller's death, the Grande Armée of the French Empire broke camp. Its emperor, a short, relentless man who had read a certain German novel 7 times, was marching his cannons toward the quiet duchy of Weimar itself. The war reached Weimar on the 14th of October, 1806, and it did not knock. That morning, a few miles away on the plateau above Jena, Napoleon shattered the Prussian army in one of the most one-sided great battles of the age. By afternoon, the wreckage of that army was pouring through Weimar's streets with French cavalry behind it. Then came the victors, and with them what came everywhere in that century behind a victory. Looting. Soldiers broke into houses along the streets. Cellars were emptied. Toward evening they reached the big house on the Frauenplan, where one of the most famous writers in Europe was, by the accounts of that night, in no condition of heroism. He was 57, shaken, and by some tellings already in his nightclothes. What happened next belongs to Christian Vulpius, and I have been waiting 22 years of story time to tell it. When armed and drunken soldiers forced their way in during the night and, by the household's accounts, threatened Goethe himself, it was Christiane who put herself bodily in front of them. She raised an uproar, rallied the servants, and got the intruders out of the house. The details vary among the tellings, as details of a chaotic night will, but the core is consistent in the family record. The mocked companion, the woman the fine ladies would not greet, face down the grande armée with a candle and a temper, while the genius stood behind her. Some days later, billeting and protection orders regularized the house's safety. The town around them had been plundered. The house stood, and Goethe did something that tells you he knew exactly what he had witnessed. 5 days after the battle, on the 19th of October, 1806, in the sacristy of the court church, with the city still smelling of smoke, he married her. After 18 years, 5 children, and a society's worth of sneers. The wedding took 90 years of gossip, and ended it in 10 minutes. He had the wedding rings engraved, by the common account, not with the wedding date alone, but with the date of the catastrophe, as if to say plainly, this is why. If a novelist invented that touch, you would call it too neat. Weimar society, given the choice between honouring the new Frau von Goethe and continuing the old frieze, largely chose a third option, hypocrisy, and received her thereafter with the smallest legal minimum of courtesy. He never appeared to care. The house was hers now in law, as it had long been. In fact, 2 years later came a month that held, within a few weeks of each other, one of the deepest losses of his life and the strangest audience of it. In September of 1808, word came from Frankfurt that his mother had died, Katharina Elisabeth, the storyteller of the Hirschgraben, the woman who had taught him that a tale belongs to whoever can finish it best, had lived on in the old city for decades, cheerful and shrewd, keeping his room and his legend. He had visited her rarely. A fact, his biographers note with a wince, and the warmth between them had lived mostly in letters. He did not travel to the funeral. He rarely travelled to any funeral, as this story will show again, and I will not decorate the fact. I will only set it beside another one. To the end of her life she signed herself, in letters that survive, as the mother of the famous son, and to the end of his, the storytellers in his books, the wise, warm, unstoppable talkers, kept sounding like her. Then, within weeks, the summons. In the autumn of 1808, Napoleon gathered the princes of Germany at a congress in Erfurt, a political theatre staged to dazzle the Tsar of Russia. In the margins of it, the Emperor of the French asked to see Goethe. The audience took place on the 2nd of October, in Napoleon's quarters, the Conqueror at breakfast, dispatches arriving, marshals moving in and out. Napoleon looked up at the visitor, studied him, and delivered the greeting that has been quoted for 2 centuries. Vous êtes un homme. You are a man. The remark comes to us from the accounts written afterward, Goethe's own brief notes among them. So give it the same careful frame as every famous sentence in this story. But the meeting itself, its length, its warmth, and its substance are well attested. They talked about Werther, which the emperor had read 7 times and criticized in detail. One passage in particular he considered contrary to nature, and Goethe, by his own account, conceded the point with amusement, noting that the emperor had studied the book the way a judge studies a brief. They talked of tragedy, of fate, of what drama should be in a modern age. Napoleon is reported to have said that politics is fate, and the emperor invited the poet to Paris, an invitation history did not allow to be kept. Now the uncomfortable part, which a truthful telling cannot skip. Goethe was impressed, deeply, and he stayed impressed. He accepted the cross of the Legion of Honor from Napoleon and wore it, by multiple accounts, with visible pride, including in years when wearing it in Germany took a certain nerve. When Germany rose against the French occupation in 1813, in the war his own son wished to join. Goethe remained conspicuously cold toward the patriotic fever. He told more than one visitor, in remarks that survive in their memoirs, that the man was simply too great to be beaten by enthusiasm. Germans have argued about his conduct in those years, from that day to this. I will offer you my reading. Marked as mine. Goethe did not love conquest. He had seen what armies do to towns at close range. In his own hallway, what he saw in Napoleon was the thing he had spent his life seeking in nature and art. Enormous force, mastered by enormous form. A volcano that had somehow organized itself into a government. He was wrong about how that story would end. And Europe paid the bill for the delusion he shared with millions. But he was never merely starstruck. He was looking at the largest natural phenomenon of his lifetime, and he classified it the way he classified everything, by looking hard and refusing to repeat the opinions of the newspapers. The empire fell, in time, and the kings came back, and the house on the Frauenplan grew older with its 2 inhabitants. And then came June of 1816. Christiane fell gravely ill that month. With violent convulsions, the medicine of her day could neither name with confidence nor ease. The illness lasted days, and the household accounts make them hard to read. Goethe was himself sick, or said he was, and did not sit at her deathbed. On the 6th of June she died, at 51, with none of the family in the room, attended by servants. He did not attend the funeral either. You may sit in judgment of that. Many have, but before you close the case, hear the rest of the evidence. In his diary, against those days, stand short entries in a hand described as unsteady, and one line among them has been quoted ever since. Emptiness and deathly silence, in me and around me. And a note he wrote in those same days says simply that the whole gain of his life was to weep over her loss. The man who could not walk into the room where she was dying wrote her. In the privacy of a diary, no one was meant to admire. The plainest sentences of grief he ever produced. I told you at the start of this night that the gift and the guilt of this man are the same trait. Seen at different hours, here is that trait at its darkest hour. He could transform anything except the sight of loss itself. From that, all his life, he simply turned away, and then paid for the turning. Alone, in ink. The house was quiet now. The son, August, grown and struggling in his father's enormous shadow, managed the practical world. The father, past 70, turned for consolation to the two oldest loves he had. One was science, the other was a book from the East, and the last full act of this story begins with an old man, à prisme, and a fight he could not win and would not leave. Of everything Goethe made in 82 years, the work he himself rated highest was not Faust, not Werther, not the poems. In his last years, he told his young secretary, Johann Peter Eckermann, who wrote the conversations down, that others had written great poetry, but that in his own century he alone knew the truth about colour. Posterity has returned the compliment by treating his theory of colours as the great embarrassment of a great career. Both verdicts, his and posterity's, deserve a fair hearing tonight. The argument between them goes to the centre of who this man was. The obsession had started back before Italy, and by his own famous account it began with a borrowed prism. Preparing to test Newton's optics for himself, he looked through the prism at a white wall. He expected, from his reading of the theory, to see the wall split into colours. The wall stayed white. Colours appeared only at edges, where light met dark. Now, a physicist will tell you, correctly, that this is exactly what Newtonian optics predicts for that setup. Goethe had misunderstood the experiment he thought he was refuting. But Goethe, electrified, concluded on the spot that the reigning theory was false. He spent the better part of 40 years, and by his own accounting more labour than any poem ever cost him, building an alternative. The result? Published in 1810 as The Theory of Colours, is a huge, strange, magnificent book, part experimental catalogue, part polemic, part history of science. Its central claim is that colours are not hidden inside white light waiting to be unmixed. They arise, he argued, at the meeting of light and darkness, through media, in the eye, in the world of appearances where human beings actually live. As physics, the verdict is not controversial, and honesty requires saying it without softening. Newton was right about the composition of white light. Goethe was wrong, and the polemical chapters where he attacks Newton personally did his own cause lasting damage. The professional physicists of his time largely declined even to argue. Here is where the story turns. Though, if that were all, we could file the affair under genius wastes decades, and we would be filing it falsely. Read what Goethe was actually best at in that book. He was cataloguing phenomena of perception, coloured shadows, after-images, the way the eye summons a colour's opposite without being asked, the way context changes what a colour is for the person seeing it. He insisted that the experience of colour, the event happening between the light, the eye, and the mind, was itself a legitimate object of science, not an error to be corrected away. On that ground, the long verdict has been kinder. Students of vision in the following century took his observations seriously. Painters from Turner onward studied the book. Philosophers, notably Wittgenstein, wrestled with it respectfully. The fairest summary I can give you, and I mark it as my own judgment resting on that record, is this. He lost the argument he picked about physics, and he helped open an argument he did not know he was picking, about perception, and the question he helped raise still echoes in studies of how we see. There is a deeper layer, and it is the reason this chapter sits where it does in our night. The colour theory was not a hobby gone feral. It was Goethe's whole soul making its final stand. All his life, from the sick-room alchemy books to the archetypal plant in the Palermo garden, he had held one conviction. Truth is reached by loving, patient, unarmed observation, the human being standing inside the phenomena, learning to see Newton's method, the darkened room, the isolated ray, the mathematics, struck him as truth by interrogation, nature stretched on an apparatus and forced to confess. He feared, and said in many forms, that a science which removes the human witness from the world would end by handing us a world not worth witnessing. As physics, that fear built nothing. As prophecy about the modern condition, you may judge for yourself tonight. In a century, still learning what it costs to know everything about the world and feel very little in it. And while the old man fought the physicists with one hand, with the other he was writing love poems. Thereby hangs the strangest, most tender episode of his old age. In 1814, in his mid-60s, he discovered in translation the poems of Hafez, the 14th century Persian master. The encounter hit him, by his own testimony, like a second Italy. Out of it grew the West Eastern Divan, a great cycle of poems in which an aging German speaks through Persian masks about wine, God, and love, one civilization bowing to another across 500 years. Scholars have called it an early masterpiece of what Goethe himself would later name world literature, a bridge built on purpose between East and West. But the Divan has a second author hidden inside it, and her name deserves saying, Marianne von Willemer, the young wife of a Frankfurt banker friend, exchanged poems with Goethe during the journeys of those years. Inside the book's own Persian costume, several poems he published in the cycle are now known to be substantially her work. The evidence emerged only after all concerned were dead, and as far as the record shows, she kept the secret out of love rather than obligation. One of the most celebrated poets alive, in his 60s, published a masterpiece with a hidden co-author, and the secret held for decades. What passed between them beyond the poems? The poems themselves are the record of. It is a record written deliberately, in masks. Let the pace of this night slow a little now, because his life was slowing. Picture him at 73, in the summer of 1823, decorated, widowed, world famous, arguing about optics, corresponding in Persian disguises, presiding over a house full of visitors who arrive as if to view a monument. Every story we have told tonight seems finished. The loves concluded. The wars survived. The great works either done or permanently fragmentary. A monument is exactly what Europe now believed him to be. And then the monument went to the spa town of Marienbad for his health, and saw a girl of 19 across a room, and the oldest engine in this whole story turned over one last time. Marienbad, in the 1820s, was a new and fashionable spa in the Bohemian hills. White facades, colonnade, mineral springs, the wealthy of Europe drinking the waters and inspecting each other. Goethe went there for his health in 3 successive summers. In the first of them, in 1821, he was introduced to the family von Levetzow, and to the eldest daughter of the house, Ulrike, who was then 17. He was 71. She was polite, lively, and entirely unbookish. By her own account, given in old age, she had not read his famous works. She treated him not as a monument, but as a kind, endlessly interesting elderly friend, who walked with her, joked with her, and explained minerals. Perhaps that was the whole spell. After a lifetime of being approached through his fame, here was a person who simply liked his company. The record of the following summers suggests that the old man mistook, or half mistook, or refused to examine what was growing in himself. By the 3rd summer, at Marienbad in 1823, there was no more mistaking it. He was 73, and he was in love, fully, helplessly, in the way this story has watched him be in love since a pastor's garden in Sesenheim, more than half a century earlier. The court noticed, the spa noticed, his own family, above all his son, August, watched with rising alarm that had as much to do with inheritance as with propriety. And then Goethe did the thing that even his most devoted biographers still handle with a kind of wince. He asked his old friend Karl August, the duke he had once taught to govern, now a Grand Duke, to act as his intermediary. The sovereign of Weimar formally conveyed to Frau von Levetzow a proposal of marriage from the most famous man in Germany, aged 73, for her daughter, aged 19. The family did not laugh. To their lasting credit, the mother deflected gently, citing her daughter's youth, and asked that nothing be pressed. Ulrike herself, in the account she gave decades later as an old woman who never married, insisted that it had been no love affair on her side. She had felt respect and fondness for a fatherly friend, she said, and she had not been made unhappy by the episode. Whether the old man ever fully understood the refusal as a refusal, the letters of that autumn suggest he did, and could not say so. He stayed near the family through the late summer, hoping. There is an account of a last morning, a farewell, a kiss that may have been anything or nothing. Then the carriage door closed, and Goethe left Marienbad, and Ulrike von Levetzow, forever. What happened inside that carriage over the following days is one of the strangest recorded events in the history of literature, because we can very nearly watch it, rolling east through Bohemia. The old man began to write. By the time he reached Weimar, he had completed a poem of 23 stanzas, which he called simply an elegy, and which the world calls the Marienbad Elegy. Those close to him have left descriptions of what it meant to him. He copied it out himself, in a careful calligraphic hand, and bound it in silk. His friend Zelter, the composer, who came to Weimar and found him shaken, read it aloud to him, again and again, by Zelter's own account. Like medicine administered by the spoonful, it is the sound of a man performing surgery on himself and taking notes while he does it. The poem asks, What remains of a person when the one thing that made the hours bearable is taken away? It does not comfort itself with a false answer. Many critics, across 2 centuries, have judged it among the greatest poems of loss in the German language. Whatever ranking means in such matters, this much is plain fact. At 74, out of a humiliation that would have silenced most men half his age, Goethe made a thing that outlived everyone who had smiled at him behind their hands in Marienbad. And now I will give you the editorial heart of this chapter, and of much of this night. It is easy to tell the Ulrich episode as comedy, the old fool and the girl. Weimar told it that way at the time. It is easy to tell it as something darker, an old man's power aimed at a teenager, and a modern listener is right to feel that edge. And I will not talk you out of feeling it, but sit with the whole record, her own calm testimony included, and a third telling emerges. Goethe had organized his entire existence around one faith. Feeling, however dangerous, is the raw material of everything worth making, and the correct response to overwhelming experience is not to flee it, but to transform it. At 24, that faith produced Werther. At 74, the machinery still worked. The heart broke on schedule, and the transformation fired one last time at full power. You do not have to admire the man in the spa colonnade. The man in the carriage, writing, is another matter, he said, in lines from these years that are often quoted, that he had been given the gift of saying what he suffered. That is either the saddest sentence in this story or the most triumphant. The honest answer is that it is both at once. After Marienbad he never seriously left Weimar again. The doors of the heart, he indicated in more than one late conversation, were now closed. What remained was work, and one work above all. In a drawer in the house on the Frauenplan lay a manuscript he had first touched as a young man in Frankfurt. Before Weimar, before Italy, before everyone in this story who was now dead, he was the last one left, and the last thing he owed was to a man who sells his soul. To understand what Faust meant to Goethe, hold the dates in your mind. He began writing scenes of it in the early 1770s. In his 20s, in the first heat after Strasbourg, he finished it in the summer of 1831, in his 82nd year. 60 years, more or less. One book, carried through every chapter of the life we have followed tonight, worked on beside Charlotte von Stein, dragged forward by Schiller's siege, set down for decades, taken up again in old age. With the tenacity of a man completing a cathedral he knows he will never attend. The first part, the famous tragedy of the scholar, the devil's wager, and the ruin of the trusting girl Gretchen, in whom readers have long heard the echo of Sesenheim, had appeared in 1808 and conquered the world's stages in due course. The second part was another creature entirely. Vast, strange, symbolic, ranging through emperors' courts and classical dreamscapes. Its author worked on it knowing that his own century would mostly not understand it, and he said as much, in his last years, to the young man who now enters our story by name. Johann Peter Eckermann had arrived in Weimar in 1823, a poor young writer who came to visit his idol and stayed, in the end, for 9 years, as assistant, listener, and recorder. The book he later published, his conversations with Goethe, is one of the great portraits of one human being by another, and much of what we know about these final years comes through his careful pages. A debt every teller of this story owes and should say aloud. It is Eckermann who preserved the old man's working habits, his opinions on everything from Byron to botany, and the progress, season by season, of the second part of Faust, and it is from these final years that so many of Goethe's most quoted sayings come, set down by the young man in the evenings, sometimes polished, scholars remind us, by the young man's own reverent hand. In late July of 1831, it was done. By Eckermann's account, Goethe had the completed manuscript of Faust Part II wrapped and sealed, and declared his remaining days a gift. Since the main business of his life was now concluded, he gave instructions that the sealed work was to be published only after his death. Think about what that gesture contains. One of the most famous authors alive, holding the certain masterpiece of his age, chose to forego every hour of its applause, so that the book would enter the world without him and be argued with on its own. Once, in January of 1832, in the last winter of his life, he broke the seal. He read passages to his beloved daughter-in-law, Ottilie, and spoke of the work again with Eckermann in those weeks. And then the packet was closed once more. The image has followed the book ever since. An old man opening his life's work by candlelight, for an audience of one, then sealing it again against the whole world. The last winter is documented almost day by day, and it was a winter that had been coming for some time. His son August had died a year and a half before. In October of 1830, in Rome of all cities, on the journey his father had once made to be reborn, those around Goethe recorded that the news aged him overnight as nothing else ever had, and that he did not permit himself to speak of it. He worked on, he still rose early, still received the stream of pilgrims, poets, scientists, princes, young travellers with letters of introduction, for whom a visit to the old man of Weimar had become a station of European life. In mid-March of 1832 he caught a chill, rallied, then declined. On the morning of the 22nd of March, 1832, in the armchair of his small bedroom beside his study, with Ottilie near him, he died. He was 82 years old. Almost immediately, the world began to tell the story of his last words, and you deserve the truth about them as the price of this whole truthful night. The famous version is a phrase of 2 words, mehr Licht, more light. It swept through Europe within months, because it was perfect. The seer of the age, calling for illumination at the threshold. The documentary basis is thinner than the fame. The phrase comes from recollections of the sick room, reporting that he asked for the second shutter to be opened, so that more light might come in. A practical request. From a dying man in a dark room, if it was said in that form at all. Other accounts of the final hours record other, smaller words, some addressed to Ottilie, and some accounts suggest the very last communications were not words at all, but a letter traced with his finger in the air, and on the blanket across his knees. Perhaps he said more light, and meant the shutters, perhaps memory and Europe, collaborating as they always do, composed the epitaph he would have edited into shape himself, I give you the legend and the ledger side by side, because after everything we have seen tonight, you have earned the right to hold both. They buried him in the ducal vault in Weimar, beside Schiller, or beside what was then believed to be Schiller, for even that coffin has its own disputed history. The two friends together, the friendship given the last word over everything else, and there they lie tonight. And now, before we let him go, walk back with me one last time, slowly, through the rooms of this long life, the way you might walk through a house at night, turning off the lamps one by one. The house in Frankfurt first, the boy lying awake, inventing better endings for his mother's stories. Certain, before he could have said it, that a story left in the wrong hands will end wrong. The sister 1 year behind him, his first audience, his first critic, whose lamp went out too early and whose share of the inheritance he carried the rest of the way. The sick room, and the strange old books, and the first quiet suspicion that everything in the world might be one thing wearing different faces. The garden in Sesenheim, and the debt he contracted there, which he paid in literature because he could not pay it in life. The blue coat and the yellow waistcoat, and a continent weeping over a novel, and a young man discovering that fame is a portrait that follows you, asking why you no longer resemble it. Let the lamps go out in Weimar too. The files and the mines and the roads. The 10 years of harness he chose, because unlimited freedom was the one thing his gift could not survive. The 1,700 letters to a woman whose answers are silence. The coach at 3 a.m, the false name, the light of Italy falling on a man learning, at 37, to be nobody, and liking it. The flower girl in the park who became, against the judgment of every fine drawing-room in the duchy, the one person who never asked him to perform, who stood in the doorway with a candle when the Empire came up the stairs, and who left, one June morning, a silence in that house that its owner could describe only as deathly. In a diary no one was meant to admire. Let Erfurt fade, and the Emperor at breakfast, and the wars. Let the argument about light and colour fade too, the argument he lost in the laboratories, though painters, ever since, have kept finding blue in the shadows he pointed to. Let Marienbad fade last of all, the colonnade, the girl, the closed carriage door, and the sound, which no one heard, but which we have imagined together tonight, of an old heart turning its final catastrophe into stanzas, as the wheels turned beneath it. What remains when all the lamps are out? He would have had an answer, because he always had an answer. But tonight we can let ours be simpler than his. What remains is the pattern he kept proving with his one long life. A human being does not have to be one thing. The poet can audit the mines. The minister can study the leaf. The old man can break his heart at 73 and make from the wreckage something 19-year-olds will read when every witness is dust. He was not the best man in this story we have told. He was, perhaps, the most complete one. And completeness, he seems to whisper across 2 centuries, is not something you are given. It is something you refuse to stop becoming. So, as you drift now towards sleep, you do not need to keep the dates, or the titles, or the arguments. Keep, if you keep anything, the window, the boy at the window, watching for the story to come out right. The traveller at the window of the coach going south, the old man asking, or so the world chose to remember, for the shutters to be opened and the morning to be let in. If this journey through one enormous life earned a place in your evening, legends uncovered will be here with another, one great life at a time, whenever you are ready. And here is a small question to carry down into sleep with you. Of all the lives this one man managed to live, the poet, the scientist, the minister, the lover, the old man, still learning, which one would you live, if tomorrow offered it? There is no hurry to answer. The house is quiet now. The manuscript is sealed. The candle is out, and the long story has reached the place where all stories rest. More light will come in the morning. Rest well,